And we're now going to go to Karadanski. So Karadanski is the president of WDI USA, a very well-known attorney and author of the fantastic book, The Abolition of Sex, which was published at the beginning of this year. And if you haven't read it, highly recommend you read it. It's a really, probably, I would say it is the best book published in the last 2 years on this issue. And it's not just a rundown of what's happening and what, although it is, it's incredibly interesting insight into American law, but also into feminist politics. It's just brilliant. So, but anyway, we're not talking about that now. We're talking about what's happening with this film. So over to you, Kara.
So I'm going to be talking about the recent film, What is a Woman? So on June 1st, 2022, the Daily Wire produced a film featuring Christian conservative traditionalist Matt Walsh. The title of the film was What is a Woman? And it mostly involved Walsh going around the world and asking various people, including both experts on sex and gender and ordinary people on the street, that very question. Over the course of the hour and a half, no one appears to be able to answer it. Finally, at the end of the film, Walsh's wife answers the question in a manner that we would all recognize when she says adult human female. I'd like to take some time here to explain who Walsh is and whether there were any feminists involved in the production of the film, and to place the film in context given the state of political play regarding matters of sex and gender in the States today. Then I'll read the statement that the US chapter of Women's Declaration International put out following the film's release. The Daily Wire is an American conservative news website and media company founded in 2015 by commentator Ben Shapiro. Shapiro is an extremely intelligent and also extremely conservative man who detests feminism. It is funded in large part by billionaires and fracking executives, all men. Matt Walsh has a show on the Daily Wire called The Matt Walsh Show. Matt Walsh has had a few things to say about feminists and feminism on Twitter, and here I'm quoting him. The first one, feminism has become the most vacuous and useless movement known to humanity. These women are desperate to be oppressed, but sadly for them, they live in the freest and most prosperous country on earth. So they spend their time inventing boogeymen to fight. 2, he says, feminism is rotten at the core. Each wave led inexorably to the next. There is no good feminism. It's one of the worst things to ever happen to Western civilization. 3, he says, there really is no creature on earth more repulsive than a bitter old boomer pro-abortion feminist. These people are just absolute heinous monsters. They've overseen the slaughter of 60 million children and still aren't satisfied. Bloodthirsty psychopaths. Those are just a few of the things that Walsh has had to say about feminists and feminism. Walsh clearly is no friend to feminism. It is presumably for this reason that he did not invite any radical feminists to participate in the film. He stated on Twitter that he had invited several of the most prominent feminists to participate, and they all declined. I think that he's using his words very advisedly here. He is saying very prominent feminists because he knows that radical feminists are not prominent in the US. Most likely, in my view, he invited the leaders of groups like the National Organization for Women and Planned Parenthood, both of which yell that trans women are women on a regular basis, knowing that they would say no. That way, when the inevitable backlash from actual feminists came, he could say that he invited prominent feminists. It's probably true that he invited women who most of us would refer to as liberal feminists. I can only say with certainty that he did not invite anyone from WDI USA to participate. Many have hailed the movie as a success, and I understand why. As our chapter explains in our statement, which I'll read in a minute, the film does a number of things effectively. A lot of these proponents of the project take Walsh at his word when he says that he invited so-called prominent feminists and speculate that maybe he just doesn't know about actual radical feminists who might be inclined to agree with him about gender identity. That is wrong. Walsh knows exactly where to find the radical feminists. I know this because when my book was published in November 2021, the book publicist reached out to both Walsh and the Daily Wire several times, requesting interviews. Those requests went unanswered. Several months later, I DM'd Walsh on Twitter, no response. At one point though, on Twitter, he engaged with me. I told him that I'd like to go on his show to talk, and he declined, stating that his podcast format does not lend itself to interviews. During our Twitter back and forth, it became abundantly clear to me that he knows who I am and that he had simply been ignoring me the entire time. More recently, he tweeted that he would be happy to work with anyone who can help take down gender ideology, and I responded, great, let's talk. I DM'd him again, and this time he responded to say that he was willing to talk in a public forum. I asked if he's able to get us a spot on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he said he could not, and that is as far as the conversation has gone to date. As a political matter, I don't really think that Walsh is important to the fight to push back against gender ideology in the US. The reason that I think that is that the critical demographic that American radical feminists need to reach if we're going to win is mainstream liberals. Most mainstream American liberals think that gender identity is nonsense as soon as they understand what it actually is. The problem for us is that most of them have no idea what it is because the American media deliberately keeps them in the dark. I have said before that if radical feminists, lesbian rights activists, and biologists can be heard, we will win. And I continue to think that is true. No mainstream American liberal is going to be persuaded by a production in the Daily Wire featuring a Christian conservative traditionalist that contains no sane leftist voices at all. So I don't think we need men like Matt Walsh fighting these battles. However, although we don't need men like him, we're stuck with him. If I could blink my eyes and make him disappear from the scene, I would do that. But I don't have the power to do that. Walsh is going to remain on the scene. To the extent that he is going to remain on the scene then, what Americans like WDI USA need to do is figure out how to use his platform to advance our message. We know that this is not ideal, but as long as he's going to be around, I intend to make sure that he's useful. Which brings me to the final point I want to make about the current political climate on sex and gender in the US. There are many conservative individuals and organizations in the States that understand the value that leftist feminists bring to the discussion. Groups like WDI USA and Wolf have spent years cultivating some very positive relationships with some of them. They understand that if the fight is always framed as being the big bad Christian American right on one side and an allegedly marginalized community on the other side, the right is going to lose. And so they use us. They bring us into meetings and they platform our voices. When I say that I'm a lifelong Democrat who brings a leftist feminist critique of gender identity, it's harder for Democrats to ignore me than it is for Democrats to ignore the conservatives. This is, of course, precisely why the media shuts us completely out of the conversation. To date, Walsh has been either unable or unwilling to grasp this political reality. He may not understand it, or he may understand it and not care. I don't know. My assumption has been that he does not want to platform us because he is reluctant to acknowledge that feminists have accomplished something of value and that we actually have good ideas. So we'll just have to wait and see whether he makes good on his offer to have a public discussion and to work together. I know that there are going to be loads of women who are going to be very angry with us if we share a platform with Walsh. But if we can use his money and his access to spread our message, why wouldn't we do that? So with that, here's our chapter statement about the film. Matt Walsh's new film, What is a Woman, produced by the Daily Wire, is in some ways a valuable contribution to the bipartisan movement to fight back against the inclusion of so-called gender identity in law and throughout society. It is also a celebration of sex stereotypes. Matt Walsh clearly loves sex stereotypes. The first few minutes of the film consist of a practically orgasmic celebration of girls liking pink dolls and glitter and boys liking blue trucks and guns. It ends with his wife, clad in a bathrobe and washing the dishes in the kitchen, stating that a woman is an adult human female and asking for his help in opening a jar of pickles. He goes on to open the jar, clearly quite impressed with his own virility. The film does one thing really well. It exposes the absurdity of the fact that no one seems to be able to define what a woman is. Walsh does this with humor and insight. His on-the-street interviews with strangers are a mixed bag. Most likely, a lot of the people he encounters don't have any idea why he is asking, what is a woman, because they're not enmeshed in the gender wars. Many of them seem to be genuinely surprised and not to understand the point of the question, but many of them answer along the lines of, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. And part of this project's worthy aim is to expose this absurdity. Walsh does a spectacular job in his interviews with so-called experts on topics like sex and gender. And the moment the congressperson ends the interview and walks out is brilliant. The film does something else well. It exposes the lies and the horrors of child transition. Our society, our laws, and our medical establishment are actively engaged in a eugenics project. We are mutilating and sterilizing children. We are all horrified about that and glad that he exposed this vicious industry for what it is. No one has done more to expose the industry than the 11th Hour blog, but nonetheless, the more light that is shed on this travesty, the better. Much ado has been made on social media about Walsh's failure to interview any radical feminists for the project. Many women are very angry that he appears to present himself as a savior in this fight, when women, feminists especially, have been fighting back against the movement to abolish sex for years. We understand this criticism and respect it. One might object by asking, but wait, how do you know that Walsh even knew about the radical feminist objections to gender identity? We know because when WDI USA President Karadanski's book, The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls, was published in November 2021, the book publicist repeatedly requested interviews with both Walsh and the Daily Wire. The requests were all ignored. When Kara brought this to Walsh's attention several months ago on Twitter, Walsh engaged with her and responded that his podcast format does not lend itself to interviews. Fair enough, but Walsh can't now say that he didn't know about us when he went about creating his film. We think there's a much bigger problem with Walsh's intentional omission of radical feminist voices, though. It is not that we need Walsh to appreciate the contributions of feminists. He doesn't, and we know that. None of us particularly cares what he thinks of feminists. We already know that he dismisses us. Further, feminists are not angry because their egos got hurt. None of us is interested in fame for fame's sake. Many of us would likely be thrilled to win this battle and then shrink off into obscurity to live out the rest of our lives on the beach or in the mountains. The problem with Matt's failure to include radical feminist voices is that it is a terrible political strategy. The fight against the gender industry, what the 11th Hour blog calls the techno-medical complex, consists of lots of diverse players with different viewpoints and values. That's a good thing. It is well known that radical feminist groups like WDI USA are comfortable working with conservative organizations when it is strategic to do so, and it often is. WDI USA has accomplished a lot by working with conservative organizations, especially women's groups like the Independent Women's Forum and Concerned Women for America, who understand the strategic importance of highlighting leftist radical feminist voices in the fight. These groups understand this. If this political battle consists of the big bad Christian right versus a marginalized group of trans people, women are going to lose. They understand that they need our voices if we collectively are going to win. Matt either doesn't or won't grasp this. We understand the value of this film in exposing things that need to be exposed. We also think that the key demographic in winning this political battle are going to be mainstream liberals who are still in the dark about the dangers of gender identity because the media keeps them there. Most mainstream liberals quickly see through the absurdity of gender identity once it is pointed out to them. We also think that approximately 0 of them are going to be persuaded by or even know about a film produced by the Daily Wire featuring a known Christian conservative traditionalist that omits the leftist feminist critique of gender identity entirely. Many men, including Walsh, know what a woman is because they know exactly upon whose neck to place their boots. We would welcome the opportunity to talk with them to see if they can be persuaded that they need radical feminist voices if they want to win. Until then, they aren't helping. While we were composing this statement, Walsh tweeted this offer to join forces with anyone to bring down gender ideology. WDI USA President Karadanski tweeted this, and that's my response. Great, let's talk. In response, we'll see if he makes good on his offer. That's the end of the statement. There are some really other interesting reviews available online. Victoria Smith, who goes by Glosswitch on Twitter, has a great review out in The Critic, and Kelly J. Keene reviewed it on her YouTube channel. I'll just end by telling a quick story about a different Matt Taibbi. Taibbi is a fairly prominent voice in US leftist politics. He has written several books, and he has a large platform on the US left. He covered the rallies at the US Supreme Court in December 2021, when both pro-abortion and anti-abortion groups appeared during oral arguments in the Dobbs v. Jackson women's health case, the very case that appears to be set to overturn Roe v. Wade. Several signatories to the declaration were there that day to rally in favor of Roe. We held signs that said things like, abortion is a women's sex-based right, and only women need abortions. We had a megaphone, and we used it to chant and sing songs like, woman, adult human female, I am a woman. We didn't know it at the time, but his videographer was there, capturing footage of us chanting and singing. A clip later showed up in a piece that he published about the rallies. One of us, Jessica Gonzalez, who has appeared on Feminist Question Time before, happened to know the videographer and sent me his email address. I used that address to get in touch with Taibbi, who eventually agreed to talk with me. He and I talked in January via Zoom. We talked a lot. We talked for hours. He promised me that he would publish our interview. He didn't. Then, just last week, he got back to me. He apologized for the delay. He acknowledged that he sat on the interview because he was afraid of blowback from trans activists. He has acknowledged all of this publicly and has now published our interview. The interview presents a leftist feminist critique of gender identity, and it has the potential to reach millions of American leftists. My hope is that it will do some good and that it will open American liberals' eyes to the harms of gender ideology. Significantly, in my view, he made his piece free to anyone who wants to read it. In contrast, he limits most of his posts to paid subscribers only. Then, just yesterday, he posted a piece responding to the blowback he had gotten for posting a positive review of Walsh's film. That piece is for paid subscribers only, so most of us can't see it. However, a friend sent me some relevant text. The piece begins with this, quote, after publishing a review of Matt Walsh's What is a Woman this week, the expected avalanche of blowback from activists and even a few friends did arrive. Most went straight to the word bigot, while others decried platforming a fascist, unquote. He goes on to say the following. The flip side of this phenomenon, however, is more subtle. In my interview with Karadanski, when I asked what her definitions of sex and gender were, she said, quote, sex is grounded in material biology. It's what we all learned in school. All human beings are sexually dimorphic mammals. Gender, on the other hand, although the terms are very frequently used interchangeably, is more about sex stereotypes. Women stereotypically like pink, men stereotypically like blue, women stereotypically are nurturing, men stereotypically are aggressive. These are stereotypes that we all have in our minds about what boys and girls are supposed to like, what men and women are supposed to like, and how we're all supposed to act. So that's Taibbi quoting me. And then Taibbi goes on to say this. I hadn't considered the possibility previously because it would be so incredibly stupid if it were the truth. And this is the key part. But what if the cascade of gender fluid rhetoric coming out of academia and pop culture these days isn't about smashing stereotypes at all, but about reinforcing them on a grand scale? Women, we are finally breaking through on the US left. People are starting to get it. We're going to win.
If feminists were able to work with right-wing misogynists like Matt Walsh, who would be using who? How would it further feminists' agenda?
So this is why I really do prefer working with women's organizations when we're working with the right at all. I think the way that it would further our agenda for Matt Walsh to platform us is I really want men like him to understand that they need us if we're going to win. And the only way to persuade them that that's true is to actually be able to have the opportunity to make the point. One of the things I said to Matt Taibbi when he asked me if was I comfortable doing things like going on the Tucker Carlson show? The answer to that question is, of course, largely no. But also I have learned over the course of the past few years that if I can only get platformed by conservative media, I'm going to take advantage of that opportunity to explain to conservatives how they get so much of this wrong, right? Because as everyone knows, it's the Democrats that are pushing this agenda. But in my view, Republicans are not doing nearly enough to stand up to them and to say, stop it already. And so one thing I can do effectively by getting platforms in conservative media is to persuade conservatives that they need to step up and do more if we're going to beat the gender identity agenda. So I have been taking opportunities when I can to do that. The other thing I just wanted to say about working with the right is that we get a lot of very practical and concrete things out of doing that. And so, for example, we are having a rally on June 23rd at the White House to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Title IX. Part of why we have been able to do that is because we have persuaded some of these conservative women's groups that this has got to be nonpartisan. This has got to be a nonpartisan women's fight to take back Title IX, among other things, for women and girls. And these women's groups, the conservative women's groups, have been persuaded that that's true. And just as an example, I recently went to Pennsylvania, which was considering a bill to protect women's sports in Pennsylvania. And there's a woman with the group Concerned Women for America who's very familiar with the Pennsylvania state legislature. And she was able to secure me some meetings, a handful with Republicans, and that's a useful thing to do. But she also was able to get me a couple meetings with Democrats, with women. And one Democrat woman voted for the Save Women's Sports bill in Pennsylvania, which is a really good thing because they have to hear from us. Because as I said, the Democrats are more likely to be persuaded by someone who calls herself a lifelong Democrat and a feminist than they are by the conservatives. And to the extent that we can persuade the conservatives that that's true, we should keep doing that.
What's the one biggest thing you think UK feminists don't understand about the US situation?
That's interesting. I mean, so this question really that Maureen asked about working with the right, we get a lot of really practical, concrete things out of having spent years forging relationships with them. And I'm not sure if that's always appreciated in the UK. And I guess the other thing I would say is that Americans often get criticism for even our Democrats are much more conservative politically than, for example, UK Labour. I think that's a totally legitimate criticism, and I get it. The other criticism that we frequently get is that Americans have no class analysis. For the most part, we're very attached to our sort of culture of rugged individualism. And I think that's a completely legitimate criticism too. What I think is maybe not always appreciated is that even though radical feminists don't like either of those things, it just is our political reality. And ultimately, we would like to change that. Of course, we would like Americans to have more of a class analysis. Of course, we would like to push our Democrats further to the left. And we will continue doing what we can to do that. And in the meantime, we simply have our political reality that we have to deal with. And if we're going to win within the current political reality, that's just the way it's going to be. And I would love it if UK feminists had an appreciation for that.